My grandfather used to say the sky told you everything 3 days out, if you were willing to actually look at it instead of just glancing up on your way to the outhouse. I was maybe 9 years old. The winter I watched him prove it. The morning had been still and almost warm for that time of year, the kind of quiet that makes a young boy think winter has finally let up. By that evening, the mercury had dropped near 40 degrees. By the second night, the wind was taking the snow sideways hard enough that you couldn't see the woodshed from the porch. My grandfather wasn't scrambling that second night. He was sitting by the stove mending a harness strap, calm as a Sunday, because everything he needed had already been done 2 days before the wind ever picked up. That's the story I want to start with today because it's the whole lesson in one afternoon. Folks assume surviving a bad Alaska blizzard is about what you do once it's already howling outside your door. It isn't. It never was. The old-timers who made it through decade after decade up here weren't the ones with some clever trick for the middle of the storm. They were the ones who were already finished preparing before the first flake came down. I'm Jed Cole, and what I know about this came from my father, and from his father before him, men who homesteaded this country back when the nearest doctor was 2 days out by dog team and there was no radio call that could shorten that trip. I want to walk you through what they actually did, the real preparation, not some fantasy about outsmarting a storm once you're caught in it. Let me be straight with you before we go any further. I'm not going to tell you how to treat frostbite or how to warm yourself up if you get caught out in the open. I'm not going to tell you some trick for a bear encounter or how to build a shelter in a whiteout, and I'm not going to tell you which berries are safe to eat off a bush in October. Those aren't things a video should ever teach you, because getting even one detail wrong on any of that can cost you your life or somebody else's, and I've got no interest in being the reason somebody guesses wrong 300 miles from the nearest hospital. What I can teach you, because I watched it work my whole childhood and I still do it myself every single year, is how a homestead gets ready before the weather turns mean. That's the whole video. Preparation, not heroics. Here's the mechanism behind why this mattered so much more back then, and honestly still matters now if you're anywhere remote. There was no snow machine idling in the yard ready to run for help, no satellite phone in a coat pocket, and certainly no aircraft coming in low to pull anybody out once the weather closed in. Whatever you had ready in your yard and in your cabin when the wind started was, for all practical purposes, everything you were going to have until the storm passed and the trails opened back up, which could be days. The modern myth is that the storm itself is the dangerous part. The wind and the cold you have to survive through sheer grit. My grandfather's generation knew better. The genuinely dangerous part was being unprepared when it arrived. Plain and simple, and every single thing they did in the days before a storm was aimed at making sure that never happened to them. That single shift in thinking, from bracing for the storm to preparing before it, is really the whole engine behind everything I'm about to walk you through. Let's get into what that preparation actually looked like item by item, because there's real depth here and every piece of it still matters today, whether you're on a remote homestead or just watching a forecast turn ugly in your own town. The first thing, and my grandfather never treated this one as optional, was the wood pile. Not enough wood for that night. Enough wood split and stacked close to the door for 3 full days minimum, because that's how long a bad system could sit over this country without breaking. He kept the kindling separate from the split rounds and kept it bone dry under a lean-to, because wet kindling in a cabin that's already losing heat is a problem you do not want to be solving with cold hands at 2 in the morning. The specific detail he taught me was to always keep 1 full day's wood inside the cabin itself, not just in the shed, because a woodshed 20 steps away might as well be 20 miles away once the wind is strong enough to take the skin off your face just crossing the yard. The second thing was water. Creeks freeze solid, hand pumps freeze solid, and a well that isn't insulated right can freeze right down the pipe if the cold snaps hard enough. So before a storm, water got hauled and stored inside the cabin in whatever containers were on hand, enough for drinking, cooking, and keeping the animals going for several days without anybody having to break trail out to a frozen creek in a whiteout. The old-timers treated water the same way they treated wood, something you stockpile ahead of the need, never something you go looking for once the need has already arrived. My grandmother kept a row of covered crocks along the back wall for exactly that reason, refilled every single week whether a storm was forecast or not. Because a habit you only start when trouble is coming is a habit you'll eventually start too late. The third thing was the animals. And this is where a lot of newer homesteaders get caught out today because they think of livestock prep as an afterthought. My grandfather fed extra that third day out, not because the animals needed more calories that particular afternoon, but because feeding heavy before a storm meant he wouldn't be forcing a path through drifted snow to the barn on the worst day of the blow. He checked every windbreak and every latch on the barn doors because a door that bangs loose in high wind can spook stock badly enough to cause real injury, and he made sure the water trough had a way to stay from freezing solid, whether that meant hauling fresh water more often or banking it with straw for insulation. The fourth thing was the stove in the chimney, and this one he was almost fussy about. A chimney with creosote built up in it is a fire risk any time of year, but it's a special kind of dangerous during a storm when help is that much farther away, and the wind itself can make a chimney fire spread faster than it would on a calm day. So before winter really set in, and again before any storm that looked serious, he'd have the flue checked and cleaned, either himself if he was confident in it or by somebody who knew the work, because a stove is the one thing in that cabin doing the most important job there is, and it doesn't get to be neglected. He'd also bank loose snow or old hay against the base of the cabin walls on the windward side, an old trick for cutting down drafts that had nothing fancy about it and everything to do with common sense about where the wind actually hits a building. The fifth thing was the larder, and this is where the old ways get genuinely clever rather than just cautious. Root cellars dug into the ground stayed at a steady temperature no matter what the sky was doing, and a family that kept theirs stocked with potatoes, carrots, and onions through the fall had food security that had nothing to do with whether a supply run into town was possible that week. Salted and smoked meat, put up properly months earlier using methods that had been handed down and proven safe over generations of actual use, meant protein on the table without anyone needing to hunt in a storm or dig through snow for anything. The point wasn't cleverness for its own sake. The point was that a full larder meant nobody in that cabin was making a single decision under pressure about where the next meal was coming from, 3 days into a storm with the trail still closed. The sixth thing, and this one gets forgotten today more than any other, was the check-in. Before a storm rolled in, my grandfather made sure somebody, whether a neighbor a half-day's travel off or family expecting a wire, knew roughly where he'd be and roughly when they should start worrying if they hadn't heard from him. That's not a small thing. That's the entire safety net for anybody living remote before there was any other kind of net to catch you. If something did go wrong, the difference between somebody noticing in a day versus somebody noticing in 3 weeks was often the difference between a rescue and a recovery. Today, that might mean a satellite messenger, a scheduled radio check, or simply a phone call to a neighbor before the lines get busy with everybody else doing the same thing. The tool has changed. The old-timer instinct behind it hasn't changed one bit. The seventh thing was gear, staged and ready by the door well before anybody needed it. Snowshoes, extra dry layers, a good headlamp with fresh batteries, all of it set in one spot, rather than scattered around a cabin where you'd have to hunt for it with numb fingers in a hurry. My grandfather's rule was that you never want the first time you look for your gear to be during the emergency itself. You want to already know exactly where it is, because you put it there on a calm afternoon 3 days before you needed it. The eighth thing, and the one people forget until the lights actually go dim, was light and warmth beyond the stove itself. A bad blizzard up here doesn't just bring cold, it brings days of gray half-light with the sun barely clearing the ridgeline before it's gone again. And if you're relying on a generator for any part of your evening, that generator can and does fail exactly when you need it most, so he kept lamp oil and a full set of candles stocked well ahead of any storm, along with extra wool blankets folded and ready near every bed in the cabin, not stuffed away in a chest somewhere out of reach. A cabin that stays lit and stays warm, even if the generator quits, is a cabin where nobody has to make a hard decision in the dark. And that's worth more than people give it credit for, until the one night it actually matters. Now here's the myth I want to bust directly, because it's the one that gets people in real trouble even now. Folks like to imagine there was some old bush trick for surviving if you got caught outside once a blizzard hit. Some clever bit of frontier know-how that let a tough enough person just tough it out in the open. I'm going to be honest with you, because that's the whole reason I make these videos. There wasn't one. The real old-timer wisdom was never a trick for surviving the storm itself. It was making absolutely sure you were never caught out in it to begin with. If you are ever caught unprepared in weather like that, the only real answer is getting to real shelter and real help as fast as you possibly can, not attempting some home remedy or some clever maneuver you half remember from a video. That's not me being cautious for the sake of it. That's exactly what kept my own family alive up here for 3 generations, and it's more honest than any fake trick could ever be. Now let me give you something you can actually act on tonight, because that's the whole point of sitting down and listening to an old man talk for 12 minutes. Start with your sourdough starter, since that's the namesake of this whole channel and it deserves its own mention. A starter left in a cold corner of the kitchen during a hard freeze can slow right down or die outright, same as it would have in any cabin up here 100 years ago. Keep it somewhere with steady warmth near the stove, but not right against direct heat, and feed it on a regular schedule so it stays active. If a real cold snap is coming, bring it closer to the heat a day ahead, the same way my grandfather brought the water buckets inside a day ahead. It's a small thing, but it's the kind of small thing that separates people who plan ahead from people who are constantly catching up. Beyond the starter, build yourself an actual 3-day list written down, not just something you plan to remember. Wood, water, feed for any animals, a check-in plan with somebody who'll notice if they don't hear from you, and your gear staged in one place by the door. Walk through that list the next time a forecast even mentions a serious system coming through, not the night before it arrives. The whole reason this works is timing. Every single item on that list is easy to do 3 days out and miserable, sometimes impossible, to do 3 hours out. And on gear itself, judge what you buy the same way an old-timer judged a tool, by whether it actually does the job in real cold, not by how it looks on a shelf. A lot of modern winter gear gets marketed on comfort and style, and comfort's fine. But the question that actually matters is whether it keeps you warm and dry doing real work outside for hours at a stretch. Ask around, read past the marketing copy, and don't assume expensive automatically means reliable. My grandfather trusted gear that had already proven itself through a few hard winters over anything shiny and new, and that's still good advice today. Whether you're buying a coat or a set of boots or a stove for your own place. Before I close out, I want to tell you about something I've put together for folks who want to take this further than one video can cover. I've written out a full homestead storm preparation checklist, the complete version of everything I touched on today, plus a few things I didn't have time for, covering wood, water, livestock, your check-in plan, and gear laid out so you can print it and pin it up by your door. It's linked below this video. I built it because a checklist you can actually hold in your hand beats trying to remember 8 different things from a video you watched once, especially on the one night you actually need it. That's the only thing I'll ask of you today, and I'll leave it right there. If you take just one thing from everything I've told you, let it be this. Don't wait for the forecast to turn ugly before you start getting ready. Go look at your own woodpile tonight, however small it is, and ask yourself honestly whether it would carry you 3 full days if the weather turned on you tomorrow morning. That question, asked honestly and acted on early, is the entire secret my grandfather's generation lived by up here long before anybody had a machine or a radio call to bail them out. It was never a trick. It was just never waiting until the storm was already at the door. Take care of yourselves out there, and I'll see you in the next one.